Right now, somewhere in a museum, there's a fossil that used to be sold as medicine. Not fake medicine, real medicine, prescribed by real doctors, for real patients, for over 2,000 years. And almost nobody selling it knew they were holding the remains of an animal that had been dead for 66 million years. Here's the part that surprises most people. This wasn't folklore passed down by storytellers who never saw anything unusual. Real people were digging real bones out of real ground, holding them in their hands, and building an entire category of medicine around them. The substance was called long gu, dragon bone, and it shows up in Chinese medical texts, going back at least 2,000 years, listed as a real ingredient with specific documented uses, treating seizures, calming nightmares, settling anxiety. It wasn't a myth sitting on a shelf, it was a product, with a supply chain, a price, and a use case doctors genuinely believed in. So where were these bones actually coming from? Central China, especially regions like Sichuan and Henan, sits on some of the richest fossil beds on the planet. Dinosaur bones, ancient mammal remains, and other prehistoric fossils have been eroding out of hillsides and riverbanks there for millions of years, long before anyone had a word for paleontology. Farmers plowing fields, villagers digging wells, people just walking through eroded gullies after a storm, they kept finding these things. Big bones. Bones too large and too strange to match any living animal anyone recognized. And here's the thing, given what they actually knew about the natural world, dragon wasn't a bad guess. It was the most reasonable explanation available. There was no concept of extinction yet. Nobody had any framework for the idea that entirely different creatures used to walk the earth and vanished millions of years before humans existed. If every animal that had ever lived was still walking around somewhere, and you found a bone bigger than an elephant's buried in solid rock, then logically, it had to belong to something that was still out there, something rare, something powerful, something worth an entire category of respect, myths, and medicine. In a world without geology as a science, dragon wasn't superstition, it was the best available theory. By at least the year 1000, dragon bone was a fixture in Chinese pharmacies, catalogued in materia medica texts alongside herbs, minerals, and other traditional remedies. Pharmacists got specific enough to distinguish between types. Some bones were labeled as coming from male dragons, some from female dragons, based on texture and color, distinctions that, looking back, likely tracked which actual extinct species the fossils came from without anyone realizing it. The most detailed account comes from Li Shizhen, a physician and naturalist writing in the 1500s. One of the most meticulous scientific minds of his era, in his Benkao Gangmu, a materia medica so comprehensive it's still referenced by historians of medicine today, he described exactly how to identify quality dragon bone by its texture, and how it clung to the tongue, how to grind and prepare it, and which specific ailments called for which specific dose. He wrote about it the way a modern pharmacist might write a monograph on a controlled substance, precise, careful, methodical, and he was completely serious about it. This wasn't a man writing down superstition he didn't believe. This was one of the sharpest observational scientists of his century, applying every tool he had, and still arriving at the wrong animal, because the right answer simply didn't exist yet anywhere in human knowledge. Think about that for a second. You've probably taken medicine before without knowing exactly what's in every capsule or exactly how it works at a molecular level. You trust the system that produced it. Li Shizhen's patients were doing the same thing, trusting a system built by careful people using the best evidence available, and the system was wrong in a way nobody alive could have caught. Here's where it gets stranger, because the mystery didn't end with ancient scholars. It ended with paleontologists. In the early 1900s, Western scientists working in China started hearing rumors that the country's pharmacies were sitting on a gold mine of fossils. In 1899, a German naturalist named K.A. Haberer began collecting dragon bone fragments directly from apothecary shops in Beijing, buying them the same way any customer would, except he sent them back to Germany for study instead of grinding them into powder. Decades later, in the 1920s and 1930s, a paleontologist named Walter Granger, working with the American Museum of Natural History, did something almost unbelievable. Instead of digging in remote fossil beds, he went shopping. He and his colleagues walked into traditional Chinese pharmacies, bought dragon bone over the counter, and brought it back for scientific analysis. Some of what they identified from these purchased fragments turned out to belong to extinct mammals, ancient rhinos, primitive horses, and creatures that had never been catalogued by science before. Pharmacy shelves, it turned out, were an accidental fossil archive, stocked for over 1,000 years by farmers and diggers who had no idea what they were really selling. That accidental archive ended up mattering more than anyone expected. Those same pharmacy purchases and the fossil beds behind them helped point Western and Chinese researchers towards some of the richest dinosaur-bearing regions on Earth. Within a few decades, China went from a country whose fossils were sold as medicine to a country producing some of the most important dinosaur discoveries in the world: feathered dinosaurs, some of the best preserved fossils ever found, entire new branches of the dinosaur family tree. The same ground that once supplied apothecary shelves became one of the most important paleontological sites on the planet. And this wasn't unique to China. Cultures all over the world independently arrived at similar conclusions when they dug up massive ancient bones with no framework for extinction to explain them. In ancient Greece, fossilized mammoth and mastodon bones found on islands and in caves were interpreted as the remains of giants and cyclopes, feeding directly into some of the earliest Greek myths about giant beings. In parts of the American Southwest, some indigenous traditions describe massive bones found in the ground as belonging to ancient monster-like creatures defeated by cultural heroes long ago. Oral histories that plausibly connect to real dinosaur and mammal fossils common in that region. Wherever massive, unfamiliar bones surfaced without a scientific explanation available yet, humans reached for the same kind of answer. Something enormous, something powerful, something that doesn't exist anymore in the way it used to. Dragons, giants, monsters, the details changed by culture, but the underlying reasoning was strikingly consistent. So here's the full picture. At least 2,000 years ago, people in China were pulling ancient fossils out of the ground and calling them dragon bone. By the year 1000, it was a documented, catalogued medicine sold in pharmacies across the country. By the 1500s, one of history's great naturalists had described it in obsessive scientific detail, still with no idea what he was actually looking at. By the early 1900s, Western paleontologists were walking into those same pharmacies with cash in hand, buying back the evidence piece by piece that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. And within a few decades after that, the same ground became a global center for dinosaur science. Nobody in this story was foolish. Every single person along that timeline was doing the most rational thing available to them with the information they had. The farmers who dug up the bones weren't being credulous. The doctors who prescribed them weren't being unscientific. They were building the best explanation they could out of real evidence using the only framework anyone had at the time. It just happened that the real answer was buried underneath a word, dragon, that took 2,000 years and a small group of scientists walking into a pharmacy to finally crack open. So the next time you walk past a dinosaur skeleton in a museum, it's worth remembering that for most of human history, bones exactly like that one weren't behind glass. They were ground into powder and swallowed as medicine by people who were absolutely certain they knew what they were holding. They were wrong about the animal. They just weren't wrong to wonder. If you want to dig deeper into any of this, all the research is linked down in the description.